Alright, so I'm gonna teach you some basics about mixing. And I'm not very good at mixing. I just want to state that I'm really not that good. I just know some basic stuff that I taught myself. So I made like a little list of stuff I'll cover. Also, if my mic like breaks, it's because I'm holding it with one hand. Because my mic arm broke, so yeah. So first off, just the thing here that says mixing is subjective. What I mean by that is like there's no like real way to mix a song. Most people just like self-teach themselves everything. So just by like watching videos of how other people do it and then they implement that. That's how I kind of learned how to mix decently, I guess. But like, you can choose to distort sounds and like compress sounds that people usually would say like, oh, you can't do that. Like an example is like people often say that you can't put stereo like wideners on bass, but you can choose to do that if you want to. It's just like, I guess to some people that doesn't sound good, but that doesn't mean you can't do it. Like you could choose how you want to mix. There's nothing stopping you from putting a compressor like where you shouldn't. But like that being said, if you want to still have like some decent sounds, there's still like some stuff you can do to just get like a general good sound. So here I have like just a project that it's like this thing. It's a remix from like an OST. And it's probably not the best example because I honestly didn't do that much mixing on it. But it's just, I'll just go over some stuff like on this as I explain stuff. General ideas and structure. So I think what I meant by this was you have to kind of tell yourself like if you have an idea for a song in your head, like how you want it to sound, you have to think about that kind of. Like, do you want your mix to sound really loud because you're making like dubstep or whatever, or do you want it to be like quieter and softer, more dynamic, less dynamic? That's basically it. Do you want like more highs or like the mix to be more warm, so less highs technically? So that's a good idea to like think about how you want your mix to sound before, just so you know like how to treat the sounds when you're mixing them. And by structure, I meant mixing in general is you have to think about it like between every sound is a different element. Like the drums are an element, there's the bass, there's like pads and strings and whatever, like all your other like sounds that are in the higher like frequency range. It's good to think about those elements being generally in the same frequency range. So like bass would be down in the lower frequency range, like sub bass would be under 60 around, under 100 maybe. Your drums are probably around 200, and all the rest up here is all like your treble and stuff. So whatever you have in the synths and stuff like chords and whatnot, it's all in the top frequency range. When you're EQing, which is actually the next point that I wanted to go to, so that's good. EQing is huge. It's literally, that's all mixing is. Like you can forget about everything else. All you need is EQing. EQing cleans up your mix because basically every sound that's in a different like element frequency range, you can clean it up by using an EQ. So like let's look at this bass. You don't like need that much high end on the bass. Like here there's like mid range and high end. But because it's a bass, you don't really need any. Where is it? It's here, I think. Yeah, you don't need much high end. I think there's still like quite a bit, but most of the good stuff is all down here. And so here I'm going to cover compressors after, but I compressed it and then I EQ'd it here. I removed some mids because I know that's where my drums are gonna be. So I just didn't want the mids to be as loud because I know my kicks and snares are gonna hit around here. So that's kind of a good thing to think about, because if you know like your drums are around 400, 500 hertz, and your bass is there, you have like a loud frequency from your bass or a synth around 400, 500 hertz, then those frequencies will probably like clash. So it's good to kind of, you don't want to like completely remove it, but just clean it up, make some space for other elements to fit there, because most of the time your kick is going to play here. So I just did that to the bass. You can also sidechain. In this project I didn't sidechain. Here I boosted the lows. And honestly, on an EQ, you don't often want to boost anything. You're most of the time, 90% of the time, you're trying to remove stuff. And one thing you always want to do on an EQ for anything that's not like bass or drums, obviously there's always exceptions, and like I said, it's subjective, but like this main pad that's in this thing that's like in the higher frequency range. So on my EQ somewhere, so on my EQ, I completely cut out any low range just to make sure there's nothing down here, because that's where my bass is. And like, because this is all mostly high frequencies, I don't need any bass in this sound. So most of it is cutting. You're just trying to cut out whatever is unnecessary. If you have a sound that's in the high frequency range, like 90% of the time, you don't really need low range, so you can cut that out. And if your bass is basically all sub bass, you can just like cut some of the highs off, and maybe some of the mids for drums. So I'll move on from EQing. I'll go to compressors, which is also like probably the second biggest thing, if not the biggest thing in mixing. Compressors are all about controlling dynamics, and dynamics are like the difference between the loudest peak and the quietest peak of your sound. So the more dynamics you have, like the more dynamic range you have in a sound, the like louder and then quieter it gets. I don't know if I explained that fucking clearly, but if your sound is not dynamic, then it's like a sausage. It's just like completely flat. Depending on like what style of music you're going for, I think like if you're into EDM, you mostly want like less dynamics. You want kind of a louder sound. As an EDM producer, you probably use more compressors than required. That's why like a lot of EDM producers use OTT, because it literally stands for like over the top compression, because it's just a really fucking strong compressor, which you honestly wouldn't use on like an acoustic song. You can, but it sounds like shit on acoustic songs because it's not really made for it. Compressors, you have your threshold, your ratio, and your gain. And attack and release is just like how fast the compression happens, like once it triggers. But essentially what happens, your ratio is like how much compression there is. If you do like a 1:1 ratio, you're not compressing like at all. There's fuck all compression. If you do like a 10:1 compressor on like drums, that's still like pretty heavy. I usually, when I compress stuff, it's pretty light, but I just like use a lot of compressors one after the other through the mixer chain. Here it's like I'm using a 2.8 ratio, like almost a 3:1 ratio, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it's still like a lot depending on what you place your threshold at. Your threshold is where, like at what point, at what peak of the signal it starts compressing. So as soon as the sound hits, in this case, negative 11.8 dB, the compressor triggers. and it takes 15 milliseconds to like fully compress, and it takes 200 milliseconds to uncompress. If you want to know more like about the exact like science behind it, then fucking look it up. But essentially, compressor equal make shit louder. I basically use a compressor on almost every sound to a certain extent. I used OTT on this with like not a lot of depth, which means it's not very strong. But I still used it just because I know, like, just even by judging, like looking at the signal wave here, some of these are like louder than others. So I kind of wanted to reduce that because I know I'm going for like a loud, more like DNB EDM song. Obviously, if I was doing like an ambient song, I'd want more dynamics. But in this case, I wanted less, so I added a compressor here. And if you want to have more control over your compression, then you use a multi-band compressor. Because essentially a multi-band compressor is just more than one compressor in one. And you can set that compressor for different frequency ranges. So you can choose like, oh, in this sound, I want to compress only like the mids of the sound. So you'd use the multi-band compressor on the mids, and then that you'd be able to compress only the mids of that sound. Limiters are compressors. The only difference between a limiter and a compressor is a limiter essentially has the ratio at 100 to 1. This is your like a compressor. Your threshold goes down. Your ratio is like this top line. And the closer it gets to like, the flatter it gets to this line here, the stronger it is. Your limiter essentially does this. It has it all the way down. And actually I'll play the song and I'll show you what happens. So notice it's squishing everything. Everything's getting quieter because it's squishing everything at a ratio of, oh, I guess it only goes to like 20 to 1 in this case, but basically your limiter squishes everything, and then you bring the gain up, and then everything sounds louder because it has less dynamics, because everything's so squished. That's what a compressor does. Filters, they're very useful, especially for like transitions and stuff into like different elements and different parts of a song. And making, honestly, just like making sounds sound cooler. Essentially, for filters, you have, this would be a high pass. This is what a high pass looks like, because you're cutting the lows and you're letting all the highs through. So you're letting the highs pass. And then a low pass looks like this. The opposite, you're letting all the lows through. A band pass is just it's a band. You're just controlling like a band, so you're technically like cutting the highs and the lows. And then there's all these different other like small bands, small like filters where like a peak is just this. They're honestly like really useful to make sounds like more dynamic and give space in a mix and just make things more interesting. So like here, if I wanted like this intro part is kind of flat, honestly. So like if I wanted, I'll just use like the mod X in here, which is a low pass filter. I could just automate this for this is the ambience, and basically make it fade in. So already like that's more interesting than how it was before, which was just flat. That's filters in a nutshell. Obviously there's more to filters, but I'm not going to cover all of that. For stereo mixing, I don't fully fucking understand that shit. And I know I said this before, like at the start, like you can put stereo on your lows, like on your bass, but I'd advise against it if you're making like EDM and stuff. If you're doing more like experimental stuff, then go ahead. But if you're just making like EDM, on your bass, you can either like mono it, or there's like on Maximus here. If you go here, it's Maximus is basically another multi-band compressor, but you can control stereo. So on each band. So if you go to the low band here, and this is your stereo knob, if you put it all the way to the right, that monos the lows. So honestly, like as a rule of thumb, For stereo, your bass should be like under 60 hertz or 100 hertz even. Basically have it mono. And mid-range can be pretty, I like to have like a wide mid-range, but sometimes that can be a little overpowering for other elements. Stereo makes everything sound much bigger than it actually is. There's like plugins like didn't mean to open that. Plugins like this, it's literally called Wider, which just uses like phase like things, phase randomness, I don't know exactly how it works, and like chorus to make sounds much wider. It kind of fucks up the sound in a way. I don't know if it's exactly like this, but I like to think about it like there's 3 channels per sound. There's your left, there's your right, and then there's like the mono, which would be like just no stereo at all. You just have to be careful. If your sound is too wide, it fucks up the sound. But just as a general rule of thumb, the low end of your song in general should be not as stereo, and the higher end should be more stereo if you want that wider sound. Also, what's cool is stereo, which I don't see a lot of people doing, but I do it pretty often, is like automating stereo. If you want, like if you're doing a build up before a drop and you want your drop to sound like much more powerful, before the drop you can make it go like almost completely mono, and then as soon as the drop hits, make it go back to stereo, and everything just sounds so much fucking bigger than it was. Like here it'll go to mono and it'll be like, it'll sound almost like flat and lame, but then it comes back and it's bigger. I don't know, it's subtle in this case, but you can just make drops like sound bigger when they hit. If you're not confident in like hearing stereo very well in your mix, then literally what you can do is just now and then check what your mix sounds like in mono. So go to your like master chain and just mono it and listen through your whole project, and you'll be able to see, oh, this like sounds too loud compared to the other. So just mix in mono for a little bit and then switch it back to stereo, and obviously like adjust accordingly. It's not perfect. Side chaining, I honestly like, I have a sidechain channel here, but like I didn't even sidechain in this project. I've been sidechaining less and less because I don't know, like sidechaining to me, before like sidechaining I used in every single song that I had because I thought it was like necessary to keep my mixes clean. But then I realized like if you can just make your mix clean enough and not sidechain, then your mix is already like really fucking good. I'd honestly sidechain last, unless you're going for that effect, like musically. Like if you're making house, like in Bowie Shop style or anything like that, then I'll like sidechain away. You can sidechain with like I use LFO tool now just because I like it, because there's like presets on it. But you can use a compressor to sidechain. You can use just automation to sidechain. I think the fanciest way to sidechain that I've seen is you use a ghost kick and you input it to P controller, and you can really control like how your sidechain sounds. But that's honestly like overkill in my opinion. I feel like people have taken sidechain way too far. Sidechaining, you're cutting out the sound for a second when your drum hits. And so that means like if you sidechain, you probably don't need to do like what I did on my bass here, where I cut out like a chunk of the mids, because the bass is being cut out completely when the kick hits because you're sidechaining. In this case I did this EQ curve because I didn't want to sidechain, but like later on I might choose to sidechain. But I'd advise like mix first and then sidechain.